today, since DLD is really about design, lifestyle, and digital, we thought that we would bring another Dane on stage, Bjarke, here next to me, and talk a little bit about things that potentially we could learn from architecture. And I think it's appropriate, especially since we sit in this building created by Frank Gehry. I'm sure if you appreciate architecture, you can appreciate kind of what has gone into the creation process here. So that's really what we want to do today. To kick this off, I want to show you a small video, because if you're not aware of some of the things Bjarke has worked on, I think it's good as a canvas and as an understanding before we start to go into a further discussion. So if we can please play the video as a starting point, that would be great.
Architecture, by definition, is the art and science of accommodating human life. Whenever you do a project, you have this ability to literally change the world. We work a lot with the idea of trying to make the city more sustainable or make a building more sustainable in a way that it becomes a contribution to the neighborhood. Quite often we try to bring very different ideas together in unusual combinations. So that can be a power plant like the one we're doing in Copenhagen, where you can ski on the roof. It can be the dry line, which is essentially doing all of the infrastructure for coastal resilience, but to do it in such a way that it actually becomes spaces for public life. For the new campus for Google in Mountain View, we've tried to bring some of the natural qualities that makes North California so unique, bring them back into the workspace. They have the best climate in the world, they have an abundance of nature, but right now it's turned into a typical office park with a sea of parking around it. And what we try to do now is to bring the nature back, not only to the outside, but also bringing it into the buildings and make sure that it's sort of integrated into the DNA of the future workspace. West 57 is the love child of a courtyard building and a skyscraper, or what we've nicknamed a court scraper. The site is beautifully located on the west side of Manhattan. It overlooks the Hudson River, the sunset, but it's also quite far away from Central Park. And it's also sandwiched between a power plant, a sanitation garage, and the West Side Highway. So we thought what they really need here is an oasis. When you take the typical European courtyard building, daylight and sunshine can come down. When you give it the density of a skyscraper, it will be too dark. So by making it massively asymmetrical, we can actually create something where the courtyard actually gets sunlight and daylight and views. It's definitely the first time we've done a building that is geometrically a hyperbolic paraboloid. But something that sounds completely surreal today is made so that it comes with positive social and environmental benefits. Architecture isn't just a question of style or ugly or beautiful. It's really a question of what kind of a city is it that we want to live in. If the city that we inherited doesn't fit with the way we want to live our lives, we actually have the possibility and the responsibility to make sure that it does in the future.
Thank you. I hope that gave you a little bit of an idea about what Bjarke is thinking and working on. Obviously, we have Bjarke here, so he can talk to that, but I wanted you to see some of the projects that Bjarke has worked on. Because I think most of us are working in businesses where innovation and rethinking the way we do things is important. And if you kind of looked at this clip, I think it was quite clear that that is exactly what Bjarke is trying to do. So Bjarke, I would actually like you to kind of talk to us a little bit about this notion you have, because I really like it, that you're not trying to innovate outside the box, you're really trying to innovate inside the box and try to use that as a canvas for creating these kind of projects that you're working on.
Yeah, because I think quite often when you, if you meet someone who's really interested in moving the boundaries, sometimes they'll say like, don't worry your creative mind with all of the practicalities of everyday life and technicality and functionality. Just go crazy, just because we really want you to think outside the box. And then if you trust them and you do what they say, you come back with something, and then there's like 100 different reasons why it won't work. Whereas I think if you start by actually sort of very carefully identifying what are the key criteria, what are the big problems, what are the greatest potential, you can actually turn those into the driving force of the design. So rather sort of thinking outside the box, really to sort of explore the entire uncharted territory that actually lies within the boundaries, maybe to move the boundaries. It's almost this sort of Zen-like idea that you turn the force of your enemy into your own strength. If you don't do it to begin with, you encounter it as obstacles. But if you start with those parameters, they make you stronger.
We didn't have, in this little clip, we didn't have the Vancouver house, which is a project you're working on in Vancouver right now. Obviously, can you talk a little bit about, because it sounds like that's exactly what you've tried to do with that project, and how that came around and how that idea actually materialized?
Yeah, I think quite often when you, if you sort of do this idea of like trying to be very, very meticulous about what the restrictions are. We're doing a project in Vancouver where Granville Bridge touches downtown. It triforks into these different lanes, and it slices a plot of land into useless triangles. And our client had been sitting with this site and didn't really know what to do about it. So then we started mapping all the constraints. And one of the constraints was almost like a deal breaker. It was that the city wants to make sure that nobody looks straight into the heavy traffic. So there's a 100-foot setback from all of the bridges. There's also a park where we can't cast shadows. So we were left with a tiny triangular footprint that was actually too small to build. And then we got the idea that if you want to ensure a minimum distance of 100 feet, once we get 100 feet up in the air, maybe the triangular footprint could actually grow and become a nice big rectangle. So the tower is literally twice as big at the top as at the bottom. It almost looks like a weed growing out of a crack in the asphalt and then blossoming once it reaches the daylight and the air. And so it looks surreal. It looks like a kind of crazy idea, but it's also what makes it perform as a real estate project, because you end up maximizing the amount of the nicest apartments with the best view. So it's almost like trying to find within all of the difficulties some kind of a loophole that can become the source of a real idea.
Another thing that's important, not only in architecture but in general, is obviously sustainability. It's, how do you kind of create, how do you build an optimism and create things that, where you build on the reverse. I think in media, in many ways, for many years it's been about if it bleeds, it leads, but there's a counter trend now where it's kind of like we should focus more on what's working. And it feels also like, with some of the projects you're doing, that you try to, look at it from this perspective. So can you talk to us a little bit about your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we from the get-go, we came up with this idea of hedonistic sustainability, that sustainability doesn't have to be a sacrifice, like taking cold showers to save the heat, but actually it should be, sustainable cities and buildings should make life even more enjoyable. And I think a really good example is our first project ever was the Copenhagen harbor bath. That in Copenhagen 15 years ago, the water became so clean in the port that you could swim in it. So you didn't have to sit in a traffic jam for 3 hours to get to the Hamptons. You could literally jump into the port in the middle of the city. So something that actually is making a cleaner environment also becomes a more enjoyable city to live in. And I think right now we're doing a building in Copenhagen, which is a waste-to-energy power plant that turns household trash into electricity and heating. But it's the cleanest waste-to-energy power plant in the world, so there's no toxins coming out of the chimney. So normally you want to be as far away from a power plant as possible. Here we actually propose that you could ski on the roof, because we don't have any mountains in Copenhagen, but now we have a 100-meter tall, it's actually twice the length of an Olympic half pipe. And some of you might have noticed that Denmark scored 0 medals in Sochi. from 2017 we can actually practice at home. So I hope to contribute to our sort of Olympic pride in the future. But it's essentially this idea that with clean tech, some of the traditional categories, this idea of a factory as being a big ugly box that casts shadows on the neighbors and blocks the view, actually can turn into, like a public park where the Copenhageners can ski, or like it's going to have the tallest climbing wall in the world, 300 feet. Extremely dangerous, but extremely cool.
And another thing that I've noticed that is a similarity with media and technology right now is in media and technology right now we talk a lot of when we kind of design new experiences. It's very much about designing responsively. Responsive design is one of the buzzwords right now when you try to create experiences for users. And I've noticed, and also when I look at your chord scraper, that's something you also try to do, right? So not just with that project, but how do you kind of try to factor that in and make it something that responds to the environment that you build it in? What's the bigger thinking behind your approach to that?
I mean, I think, and I think this is true for all kinds of design, that in a way, design, whether it's for media or like product or architecture, is somehow this idea of turning the practical into poetry in a way, and I think it's, in a way, when it really works well, it's like when you find a way to make the design an actual physical manifestation of the forces around a project. So instead of trying to impose a form arbitrarily and then struggle with all the constraints, I like this image, like sometimes a designer or an architect can be like the frustrated but slightly underdeveloped baby that's trying to hammer the square peg through the circular hole in this toy box, because you end up ruining, both the hole and the peg. But like by really trying to find out what is it really that this project wants to be, and if you can turn these conditions around a project into the driving force of the design, you will end up like discovering shapes or forms or designs that you couldn't have imagined simply because you were in a way better at listening and accommodating.
You also have talked in the past, and some of your projects also reflect this, the importance of the community, which again is also something that I think in media has become more and more important as media has been democratized. Obviously social media has exploded, and we need to find ways of re-engaging that audience. And I think with, perhaps especially with your Google headquarter, can you talk to us a little bit about kind of what the thought process was and also kind of how you try to factor that in, becoming part of the community and build it then into the project?
I mean, I think definitely it's quite clear when you look at Silicon Valley in general, like almost all of the major towns have become almost like bipolar cities, that they have a downtown. Like for example, in Mountain View, they have a downtown, and then of a similar size, they have the Google campus. So the Google campus is like, as in terms of space, it is as big and as significant a part of the city as the two main shopping streets. So these tech campuses can't any longer be sort of fortresses that seal themselves off from the surroundings. They really have to become good neighbors, and they have to somehow incorporate within them the diversity you would find in a traditional neighborhood. So there has to be a little bit of places where people can shop or eat or even live. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing was that being so heavily relying on car traffic, of course, like, it's no secret that Google is quite involved in trying to find ways of, innovative ways of looking at how to commute. And even at their suggestion, we are looking into a few other examples that almost feels like the Jetsons at the starting point. But essentially, so like a big strategy of actually bringing the nature back. So instead of parking, to actually have park. And then finally, we're trying to look at this idea that, like Google started as a hermit crab, like it sort of just moved into existing warehouses or like abandoned offices and sort of redecorated them, and it had this sort of upstart mentality. And especially Larry Page has talked a lot about this building at MIT that has a higher concentration of it's a really crappy, ugly building, but it's made all out of wood. And it has a higher concentration of Nobel Prize winners in technology than or physics than any other building at MIT. And it's basically, the thinking is that it's probably because it's so flexible. You can saw a hole in the wall, you can drill a hole in the floor, you can adapt your surroundings. So we developed the idea of, rather than sort of creating this like perfect headquarter that is like a finite mausoleum of how awesome Google is today, then to try to create this transparent canopy of very light glass fabric almost, that then creates an interior where we can control the daylight, the noise levels, the air quality. And then suddenly the workspaces become almost like giant pieces of furniture that can actually be adapted and connected and modified over time. So the idea is that rather than creating a freeze frame of this is how, like typically and sometimes in business you say, at the point where a business builds a gigantic new headquarters, that's when you should sell your stock. And we're trying to sort of not create this petrification, but actually to create an environment that's even more enabling and even more free and flexible than your typical warehouse.
You mentioned Larry a second ago. I'm sure you have a lot of great clients. Can you talk to me a little bit about, obviously a big company that is, trying to, push new frontiers, going into driverless cars, things like this. How, as a client, how have they been working with? Are they pushing you more than what you normally see? Because normally, I guess, you're pushing your clients.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that there has almost been an inversion of the process. Because, I mean, of course, we're used to working with very professional people that are used to the building industry, and they have a lot of very, very set criteria. And our job is to try to take all of that criteria, all of those criteria, and then put them together, and then in a way make a rational and clear argument of how it might make sense to go a little bit further than where you normally go. Whereas I think in the case of working for Google, it has more. I really felt like boring and technocratic at times. Sort of, it was more like this sort of attempt to try to make a really sort of like a really long perspective vision land in a safe way. And I think maybe this is true for tech companies in general, that I've rarely seen such a great respect for the value of design and research. Because you can say, like, Google are obviously a well-resourced company, but they don't want to pave their floors with marble or the walls with gold. Like, they don't want to waste resources on luxury, but they actually do have an incredible respect for the value of non-recoverable engineering, that you can actually spend a lot of time on developing a certain product that doesn't yet exist. And after you sunk all the costs of developing it, if you can then mass produce it affordably, then they will happily consume or absorb the costs taken to get there, as long as it creates a product that is now readily available and inexpensive. So, and I think that probably comes with this idea of being used to spending all the money in development, and then once you have something that works, you can multiply it infinitely. And I think it's been incredibly interesting. Like, we had a discussion about a certain conveyor system of maybe how to bring people around. And I was asking, it sounded like that there was a reference, like maybe some industry that would have a similar technology that we could appropriate. And I asked, like, is there something out there we should look into? And the answer was like, yeah, we looked into a few things. There wasn't really anything out there, but it's nothing that $50 million can solve. So that was the first time I heard a client say that.
In many ways, you're obviously an entrepreneur, and I'm sure there's a lot of entrepreneurs here. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you have built and scaled your business, and perhaps also kind of the different roles you've gone through in the different phases of the company?
I mean, there's no doubt. That I think in our case we started 10 years ago, and we've grown to being 230 people today, between here and Copenhagen. And there's no doubt that, like, I think almost like every 6 months you have to somehow reevaluate your own role and your own position. And I think maybe one of the in any creative field, I think one of the mistakes that people tend to do is that they start the company, and then automatically they think they always have to be, they naturally think that they have to become CEO. And I feel like I'm not the CEO. I have a McKinsey person, Sheila Søgaard, as the CEO. And I think what I've tried to do is always, every time we sort of scaled up, what I love to do is come up with ideas and design buildings and solve problems and as you know, make proposals. So in a way, I kept trying to sort of every 6 months see if I had started to do certain things that I didn't particularly enjoy, and then try to hire someone to take that part off my shoulders, so I could retain the role that I really truly enjoy the most.
Good. I think that's our time is coming up. I think that's a good stopping point. I hope that you got some good perspectives from Bjarke on how to grow, how to innovate, and how to use the space available within the box. I think that's a great concept. I love that. Sometimes we try to push too much outside the box without using really the space we have available. So with that, I will say Danes do love DLD, and thank you very much, Steffi. Have a great DLD.